The holy water boiled in the baptismal font the moment Father Matthias lowered the child into it. Not a simmer, but a violent, roiling boil that sent steam spiraling toward the cathedral ceiling. And through it all, the boy just smiled. You won't believe what happened next. Watch until the end. New Orleans had always been a city where the veil between worlds hung thin. In 1911, as modern innovation began challenging old beliefs, many still held tight to their faith, whether in God, spirits, or something in between. The St. Augustine Church stood tall among the oaks, its stones weathered by time and hurricane winds, its confessional booths worn smooth by the weight of 1,000 whispered sins. It was to this church that Robert and Margaret Blackwood brought their 10-year-old son, Elijah, on a humid Sunday morning in June. The boy had never been baptized, an oversight his mother was determined to correct since their recent move to the parish. He's a bit old for a baptism, Father Matthias had remarked when they first approached him after service the previous week. Usually we perform the sacrament on infants. We've moved frequently due to my husband's work, Margaret had explained, her gloved hands twisting nervously in her lap. There never seemed to be time. And then, there were complications. Father Matthias had nodded sympathetically, though something in the woman's tone gave him pause. Complications. Other churches were reluctant, Robert Blackwood had interjected, his voice low and measured. Our boy is special, Father. He sees things differently than most. The priest had agreed to meet the boy before making his decision. That meeting had lasted precisely 7 minutes before Father Matthias had rushed from his office, face ashen, to confer with Father Laurent, the elderly priest who had served St. Augustine for over 40 years. Now, as the Blackwoods waited in the empty church, Sunday service long concluded, Father Matthias and Father Laurent spoke in hushed tones behind the vestry door. There's something not right about the child, Father Laurent. The things he said to me, things he couldn't possibly know. The older priest's rheumy eyes narrowed. What things, precisely? Father Matthias glanced toward the door, lowering his voice further. He described the fire in my family's home when I was a boy, the one where I left my younger brother behind. No one knows about that. I've never spoken of it to anyone except in confession. Father Laurent crossed himself. Perhaps the boy overheard something? Servants talk, communities whisper. We're new to the area. The family just arrived from Boston last month. And there's more. He asked me if I still dream of the blue door. Father Laurent, I've had the same nightmare since childhood. A blue door at the end of a corridor that I'm terrified to open. I've never told a living soul. The old priest was silent for a long moment. I will speak with the boy myself. In the main chapel, Elijah Blackwood sat between his parents on the hard wooden pew. He was small for his age, with a pallor that suggested he spent little time in the Louisiana sun. His clothes were well made, but somber, dark shorts with suspenders over a crisp white shirt. It was his eyes, however, that commanded attention. Pale blue, almost translucent, with a directness that most adults found unsettling. How much longer, Mother? He asked, his voice carrying in the empty church. Margaret squeezed his hand. Oh, patience, Elijah. The fathers are discussing your baptism. The boy tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear. Father Laurent is afraid, he said matter-of-factly. He's remembering what happened in Baton Rouge with the deacon. Robert Blackwood stiffened. Elijah, we've discussed this. Some thoughts are best kept private. But it's true, Father. The old priest knows about Deacon Mills. He's worried the same thing will happen here. Margaret's face had gone white. How could you possibly... The vestry door opened, and Father Laurent emerged, followed by Father Matthias. The elderly priest walked slowly down the aisle, his gaze fixed on Elijah. When he reached the family, he did not offer a greeting or pleasantry. Instead, he looked directly at the boy. "Young man, I understand you have a gift for knowing things." Elijah smiled, the expression transforming his solemn face into something almost cherubic. "Not everything, Father, just the important parts, the parts people try to hide." Father Laurent's expression remained impassive, though his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his rosary beads. "And what do you see when you look at me?" Robert began to protest, but the priest held up a hand to silence him. Elijah studied the old man's face with unnerving intensity. "I see the girl from Marseille, the one with the red hair. You still keep her handkerchief, even though it's been 53 years. You take it out sometimes when you think no one is watching." Father Laurent took an involuntary step backward, his composure cracking for just a moment, the color drained from his face. "You couldn't possibly. She wasn't the reason you joined the priesthood, though. That was because of what happened on the ship coming to America. When the storm hit and you promised God you'd serve him if he saved you, you were 17. The church fell into complete silence. Even the usual creaking of the old building seemed to have stilled." Father Matthias looked between the boy and Father Laurent, confusion evident on his face. Finally, the elder priest spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know these things, child?" Elijah shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "People carry their stories with them, Father. Most just don't know how to read them." Father Laurent turned to the Blackwoods, his expression grave. "Has he always been able to see these things?" Margaret nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "Since he was 3 years old. It started with small things, knowing when visitors would arrive before they did, finding lost items without being told they were missing. Then he began telling people things about themselves, private things. By the time he was 5, the neighbors in our previous town had begun to avoid us. We've moved 7 times in the past 5 years, Father," Robert added quietly. "We had hoped New Orleans might be different. This city has a reputation for accepting the unusual." Father Laurent was silent for a long moment, studying the boy. Elijah met his gaze without hesitation. "We should proceed with the baptism, Father Matthias," he finally declared. "This child, more than most, is in need of God's grace." The younger priest looked startled. "Are you certain, Father? Perhaps we should consult with the bishop first." "I've made my decision," Father Laurent replied firmly. "Prepare the font." As Father Matthias retreated to gather the necessary items, Father Laurent leaned closer to Elijah. "Whatever your gift is, my child, remember that it comes with responsibility. To know a person's secrets is to hold their soul in your hands. Be gentle with what you find." Elijah's pale eyes seemed to look through the priest rather than at him. "Some secrets don't want to stay hidden, Father. They whisper too loudly." The baptismal ceremony began normally enough. The Blackwoods stood proudly as godparents from the local community, hastily arranged by Father Laurent, took their places beside them. The small congregation, just the family, godparents, and a few curious parishioners who had lingered after hearing rumors, watched as Father Matthias recited the traditional prayers. When it came time for the baptism itself, Father Matthias lifted the silver shell used to pour the holy water. As he dipped it into the font, Elijah stepped forward without being prompted. "It's going to boil," he said calmly. "Don't be frightened when it happens. It's just the water's way of saying hello." Father Matthias froze, shell in hand. "What did you say, my child?" "The water," Elijah repeated patiently. "It's going to boil when you put me in it. Last time, in Charleston, Father Gregory dropped me when it happened. I hope you won't do that." A murmur ran through the small gathering. Margaret Blackwood closed her eyes briefly, as if in pain. Robert placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Father Laurent stepped forward. "Continue with the sacrament, Father Matthias." With visible reluctance, the younger priest motioned for Elijah to lean over the font. As the boy bent his head, Father Matthias dipped the shell into the water. The moment the first drop touched Elijah's forehead, a hiss filled the church. The water in the font began to bubble, then churn, then erupt into a roiling boil that sent steam rising toward the rafters. Father Matthias jumped back with a startled cry, dropping the silver shell with a clatter. Through the rising steam, Elijah remained perfectly still, his pale eyes open, a small smile playing on his lips. Have you ever experienced something similar? Let us know in the comments. The parishioners scattered like startled birds, their hushed exclamations filling the church as steam continued to rise from the baptismal font. Only the Blackwoods remained calm, as if they had witnessed this phenomenon before. You won't believe what happened next. Watch until the end. Father Matthias backed away, his hands trembling as he made the sign of the cross repeatedly. Father Laurent, however, stood his ground, his rheumy eyes fixed on Elijah with a mixture of fear and fascination. The water has always reacted to him this way, Margaret Blackwood explained quietly, placing a protective hand on her son's shoulder. In every church we've tried. Father Laurent approached the font cautiously. The water had returned to stillness, though wisps of steam still curled above its surface. He dipped his fingers in, then pulled them back with a sharp intake of breath. "It's ice cold," he murmured, bewildered. "How can this be?" Elijah looked up at him with those unsettling pale eyes. "The heat goes somewhere else, Father. It always does. Look at the candles." As one, the small gathering turned toward the altar. The dozen candles that had been lit for the ceremony now burned with flames nearly a foot tall, their wax melting in rivulets down the brass holders. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," whispered one of the godparents, backing toward the exit. That's enough for today," Father Laurent declared, his authoritative tone bringing some semblance of order to the chaos. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, please bring your son to the rectory tomorrow morning. We have much to discuss. The rest of you." He turned to address the remaining parishioners, who hovered uncertainly between fascination and flight. "What you have witnessed today is a matter for the church to investigate. I urge discretion and prayer rather than gossip. Of course, by nightfall, the story of the boy who made holy water boil had spread throughout the French Quarter. By morning, it had reached the Garden District, embellished with each telling. Some claimed the boy had spoken in ancient tongues. Others insisted the crucifixes on the walls had turned upside down in his presence. A particularly dramatic account described how the stone saints had wept blood. The Blackwoods arrived at the rectory at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning. They were met not only by Fathers Laurent and Matthias, but also by Bishop Coleman, who had traveled from the diocesan offices upon hearing the disturbing reports. The bishop was a corpulent man with shrewd eyes and a reputation for political maneuvering within the church hierarchy. He studied Elijah with undisguised suspicion as the boy took a seat in the rectory's small parlor. "I understand there was quite a commotion at your baptism yesterday, young man," the bishop began, his tone falsely jovial. Elijah nodded. "Yes, sir, the water always does that. I warned Father Matthias it would happen." "So I've been told," the bishop replied, glancing at the younger priest, who seemed to be keeping as much distance as possible between himself and the boy. "Tell me, Elijah, have you experienced other unusual occurrences in your life?" Before the boy could answer, Robert Blackwood interjected, "Bishop Coleman, we've been dealing with Elijah's unique situation since he was a toddler. We've consulted physicians, psychologists, even, regrettably, a spiritualist in Boston. No one has been able to explain his abilities. And what abilities would those be, precisely?" the bishop asked, turning his penetrating gaze to the father. "He knows things he shouldn't know," Margaret answered softly. "Things about people, about their pasts, private things. And objects react strangely around him sometimes," Robert added. "Not just holy water, mirrors have cracked. Photographs develop with peculiar shadows. Clocks stop. Bishop Coleman's expression remained impassive, though his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his pectoral cross. "I see. And what does the boy himself say about these phenomena?" All eyes turned to Elijah, who had been watching the conversation with calm interest, as if they were discussing someone else entirely. "I just see the truth," he said simply. "Everyone carries it with them, like colored lights. Most people have lots of colors all mixed together, but church people are different. Their colors are stronger, especially the dark ones." The bishop stiffened. "What do you mean by dark ones, child?" Elijah tilted his head, studying the bishop with unnerving intensity. "The ones they try to hide, like the money you took from the orphanage fund to pay for your sister's medicine. It wasn't really wrong. She would have died without it, but you still feel the shadow of it around you." The room fell into stunned silence. Bishop Coleman's face had gone the color of old parchment. "How could you possibly? No one knows about that. No one." "The truth doesn't need to be told to exist, Bishop," Elijah replied, his childish voice at odds with the ancient wisdom of his words. "It's always there, waiting to be seen." Father Laurent, who had been observing quietly from his seat by the window, finally spoke. "This child has a gift or a curse. Either way, it is beyond ordinary explanation. It's demonic influence, without question," Father Matthias interjected, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "No child should know such things. It's unnatural." "Is it, though?" Father Laurent mused. "The scriptures speak of prophets and seers, of those given special gifts by the Holy Spirit. Perhaps this boy—" "This is not divine revelation, Father," the bishop cut in sharply. "This is something else entirely." Elijah had been watching the debate with mild interest. Now he turned to look at the painting of St. Augustine that hung on the rectory wall. As he stared, the others gradually fell silent, following his gaze. The painting, a reproduction of a medieval portrait, depicted the saint at his desk, quill in hand, a look of divine inspiration on his face. As they watched, a single tear appeared to form in the painted eye, then slowly tracked down the saint's cheek. "Jesus Christ," Father Matthias whispered, backing toward the door. Margaret reached for her son's hand. "Elijah, stop it." The boy turned to her, confusion evident on his face. "I'm not doing anything, Mother. He's crying because he remembers." "Remembers what?" Father Laurent asked, approaching the painting cautiously. "The real reason he became a saint," Elijah said. "Not the reasons in the books, the secret reasons he confessed only to God." Bishop Coleman had risen to his feet, his earlier composure shattered. "This ends now. This boy needs examination by qualified church authorities. I'm sending for specialists from the Vatican." Robert Blackwood stood as well, drawing himself up to his full height. "With all due respect, Bishop, we brought our son here for baptism, not inquisition. If the church cannot accommodate that simple request, we'll take him elsewhere. You don't understand the potential danger, Mr. Blackwood," the bishop replied, his voice lowered urgently. "If your son's abilities are what I suspect they might be—" "He's a child, not a demon," Margaret interrupted, her normally gentle demeanor hardening. "He has never harmed anyone." "Not physically, perhaps," Father Matthias muttered. Elijah, who had been watching the painting with rapt attention, suddenly turned toward the younger priest. "You're thinking about leaving the priesthood," he said matter-of-factly. "You have been since Easter. You think no one knows about the letters you've been writing to Miss Catherine Porter, but Father Laurent found one last week when he was looking for the communion records." Father Matthias went deathly pale. Father Laurent closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. "How could you possibly know that?" the younger priest whispered. Elijah shrugged. "The truth is loud sometimes, especially when people are afraid of it." The tension in the room was palpable. Bishop Coleman looked between the two priests, his expression darkening. "We will discuss that matter later, Father Matthias," he said coldly, before turning back to the Blackwoods. "As for your son, I cannot in good conscience allow this situation to continue without proper investigation. The incident at the baptismal font, this display with the painting, these are matters that require careful examination by experts in the Church's protocols regarding supernatural phenomena. What exactly are you proposing?" Robert asked, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "I'm not proposing anything, Mr. Blackwood. I'm informing you that I will be contacting Rome today. Until representatives arrive to assess the situation, your son should remain isolated from church property and activities." "You're banning a child from church?" Margaret asked incredulously. "I'm exercising appropriate caution, Mrs. Blackwood," the bishop replied stiffly. "Surely even you must acknowledge that your son's abilities are far from normal." Throughout this exchange, Elijah had remained calm, his pale eyes moving from one adult to the next as if he were observing an elaborate dance whose steps he already knew. Now he spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a bell through fog. "They won't come," he said simply. "Who won't come?" Bishop Coleman demanded. "The men from Rome. They'll start the journey, but they won't arrive. The short one with the glasses will become ill in New York. The tall one with the scar will receive a letter that calls him back to Vatican City. You'll be waiting for help that never arrives, Bishop." The certainty in the boy's voice sent a chill through the room. Even his parents looked disturbed by the prediction. "How could you possibly know such things?" Father Laurent asked softly. Elijah turned those unsettling pale eyes toward the elderly priest. "The same way I know about what's buried beneath the church altar. The real reason St. Augustine was chosen as the patron for this parish. The secret that's been kept for 73 years. Father Laurent's face went slack with shock. He gripped the arm of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What did you say?" he whispered. "Elijah, that's enough," Robert Blackwood interjected firmly. "We're leaving now." No, wait," Father Laurent said, his voice trembling slightly. "What does the boy mean? What secret?" Elijah looked to his father, who gave a reluctant nod. "The box beneath the altar stone," the boy said. "The one with the 7 locks. It doesn't contain a saint's relic like everyone believes. It contains the confession. Have you ever experienced something similar? Let us know in the comments." The rectory fell into a silence so profound that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed thunderous. Father Laurent had gone completely still, his aged face a mask of disbelief and growing dread. "You won't believe what happened next. Watch until the end." "What confession?" Bishop Coleman demanded, looking between the elderly priest and the unnervingly calm boy. Father Laurent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. "The child is confused," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is no box beneath the altar stone, only the standard reliquary containing the blessed remains of Saint Ignatius." Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying the old priest with those penetrating pale eyes. "You've never seen it yourself," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "But Father Marcus told you about it on his deathbed in 1897. He made you swear to protect the secret. For the good of the faithful," he said, "but you've wondered ever since if he was right." Father Laurent's hands began to tremble so violently that he had to clasp them together in his lap. "How could you possibly know about Father Marcus? No one even remembers him now. He died before you were born. The truth doesn't die with people, Father," Elijah replied simply. "It waits." Bishop Coleman had been watching this exchange with growing alarm. Now he turned to the Blackwoods, his earlier authoritative manner replaced by something closer to desperation. "Your son cannot possibly know these things. It's not merely unusual, it's impossible." Robert Blackwood sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "We've been told that in every town, Bishop, yet here we are. Elijah knows things he shouldn't know, things he couldn't know through any ordinary means. Specialists we consulted in Boston suggested he might be what they called a perfect intuitive, Margaret added, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Someone capable of reading subtle cues that most people miss. But that doesn't explain other incidents, like the water Elijah supplied helpfully, or the mirrors, or the dreams people have after meeting me. Bishop Coleman's head snapped toward the boy. What dreams? Elijah shrugged, the gesture oddly adult on his childish frame. People often dream about me after we meet. The same dream, usually. I'm standing at the foot of their bed, but I'm not really me. I'm showing them something they don't want to see. Father Matthias made a strangled sound and backed further away, pressing himself against the wall as if trying to melt into it. I've had that dream, he whispered. Last night, you were standing there, pointing at me, but your eyes were empty, Elijah finished for him. Like looking into deep water. I'm sorry about that, Father. I don't control the dreams. Bishop Coleman's face had hardened into a mask of determination. This has gone far enough. I'm placing this matter under direct diocesan authority. The boy will need to be examined by church experts in such phenomena. You mean exorcists? Margaret stated flatly. Among others, yes. The church has protocols for situations that fall outside normal understanding. Protocols designed to protect both the individual and the faithful at large. Robert Blackwood stepped forward, positioning himself between the bishop and his son. My wife and I have cooperated with every request. We've sought help from doctors, scientists, and yes, even the church. But I draw the line at having my son treated like some sort of demonic entity. He's a child with an extraordinary gift. One we don't understand, I'll grant you, but a gift nonetheless. A gift. Father Matthias's voice rose in pitch. He makes holy water boil. He knows things no child should know. He invades people's dreams. He has never harmed anyone, Robert insisted. Not once in his 10 years. Father Laurent, who had been silent since Elijah's revelation about Father Marcus, suddenly spoke. The box, he said quietly. You mentioned a box beneath the altar stone, with 7 locks. Elijah nodded solemnly. It contains the true confession of Père Christophe, the first priest of St. Augustine's, the one he couldn't tell anyone else because it would have destroyed the church before it was even built. The elderly priest's face had gone the color of old paper. And what was this confession? He asked, his voice barely audible. I don't know exactly, Elijah admitted. I just know it's there. And it's important. The church was built to keep it safe, to keep it hidden. Bishop Coleman looked between Father Laurent and the boy, his expression calculating. Father Laurent, what is the child talking about? What do you know about this matter? The elderly priest seemed to age a decade before their eyes. He slumped in his chair, shoulders bowing under an invisible weight. It's an old story, he said finally. A legend passed down among the senior clergy of this parish. I never believed it myself. Never thought it was anything but a fanciful tale meant to add mystery to the church's founding. What tale? The bishop pressed. That Père Christophe, the French missionary who established St. Augustine's in 1838, had a secret purpose in building the church on this specific plot of land, that he buried something beneath the foundation stone, something that needed to be contained by consecrated ground, and that before his death, he wrote a full confession explaining his actions, to be opened only if certain signs appeared. What signs? Margaret asked, her hand finding her son's shoulder protectively. Father Laurent's rheumy eyes fixed on Elijah, a child who could see the truth of souls, a child who could make holy water boil with his touch, a child who would know of the box without being told. The room fell silent again. Even the grandfather clock seemed to have paused its ticking, as if time itself held its breath. This is absurd, Bishop Coleman declared, though his voice lacked conviction. Some childish fancy built on coincidence and overactive imagination. "Then let us settle it," Father Laurent said, suddenly decisive. "Let us go to the church and examine the altar stone. If there is nothing there, then perhaps the boy's other pronouncements can be dismissed as well." The bishop hesitated, clearly torn between the desire to reassert control over the situation and the growing unease that perhaps there was more to this strange child than he had initially believed. "Very well," he said finally. "We will examine the altar. But regardless of what we find or don't find, I still insist on a formal evaluation of the boy." The small group made their way from the rectory to the church in tense silence. Saint Augustine's was empty at this hour on a Monday morning, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light across the worn wooden pews. Their footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as they approached the altar. A massive slab of Italian marble supported by intricately carved stone pillars. The tabernacle sat at its center, flanked by brass candlesticks and vases of fresh lilies. "The altar stone itself is beneath the marble top," Father Laurent explained, his voice echoing slightly in the empty church. "It would require several strong men to move the upper slab. Then how do you propose we examine it?" Bishop Coleman asked irritably. Elijah, who had been unnaturally quiet during their walk to the church, suddenly spoke. "We don't need to move it. There's another way in." All eyes turned to the boy. "What do you mean?" Father Laurent asked. "The access panel in the floor, behind the altar, on the right side. It leads to a small space beneath. That's how Father Marcus used to check that the box was still secure." Father Laurent's expression was one of pure astonishment. "How could you possibly know that? No one has used that access point in decades. I myself have never seen it opened." Instead of answering, Elijah walked around to the back of the altar. The adults followed, watching as the boy knelt and ran his small hand along the floor. He paused at a spot that looked no different from the surrounding stone, pressed something invisible to their eyes, and suddenly a small section of flooring, perhaps 2 feet square, shifted slightly. "It needs to be lifted now," Elijah said, looking up at the men expectantly. Father Matthias crossed himself, muttering a prayer under his breath. Bishop Coleman stood frozen, his earlier skepticism visibly crumbling. Only Father Laurent moved forward, kneeling with difficulty beside the boy and sliding his gnarled fingers into a nearly invisible groove in the stone. "Help me," he said to no one in particular. Robert Blackwood stepped forward, and together with the elderly priest lifted the heavy stone panel to reveal a dark space beneath. The smell that wafted up was ancient, the scent of still air that hadn't circulated in years, perhaps decades. Father Laurent reached into his pocket and produced a small electric torch, a modern convenience that seemed at odds with his traditional cassock. The beam of light illuminated a small chamber beneath the altar, barely large enough for a man to crawl into. And there, positioned directly beneath the center of the altar stone above, was a box. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a thick book, but it was clearly old, its wood darkened with age. And securing its lid were 7 brass locks, arranged in a circle around the perimeter. "Dear God in heaven," Bishop Coleman whispered, the color draining from his face. "It's real." Father Laurent's hand trembled, causing the beam of light to dance across the chamber. The boy was right. All this time, the legend was true. Elijah peered into the opening, his expression one of calm curiosity rather than triumph. "The keys are in different places," he said matter-of-factly. Father Marcus divided them among 7 trusted people before he died. Only one is still in New Orleans. "Where?" Father Laurent asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Around your neck, Father. The small key you think belongs to your sister's diary. It doesn't. It's for the 3rd lock." The elderly priest's free hand went to his chest, where, beneath his clerical collar and shirt, hung a small key on a thin silver chain, a key he had worn for over 20 years, ever since his sister's death. "This is impossible," he said, though the evidence before his eyes contradicted his words. "How could you know about this key?" "Even I didn't know its true purpose." Elijah shrugged, that oddly adult gesture again. "The truth wants to be known, Father. That's why it shows itself to me." Bishop Coleman had been staring at the box as if hypnotized. Now he seemed to shake himself from a trance, his expression hardening into resolve. "This changes nothing," he declared, though his voice lacked its earlier authority. "In fact, it only confirms the necessity for formal church investigation. A child with whatever abilities this boy possesses, combined with the discovery of this clearly significant religious artifact, this is precisely the sort of situation that requires Vatican oversight." Father Laurent slowly got to his feet, his old joints cracking with the effort. "What the boy has revealed today has been hidden for generations, Bishop. Perhaps we should consider the possibility that his gift, and I do believe it is a gift, not a curse, was sent to us for a purpose." "What purpose could possibly be served by a child who violates the sanctity of people's private thoughts?" Father Matthias demanded, still keeping his distance from both Elijah and the opening in the floor. "Who disrupts holy sacraments? Who invades dreams?" "Perhaps the purpose is truth itself," Margaret Blackwood suggested quietly. "My son has never used his abilities to harm. He simply reveals what is already there. And sometimes that revelation is necessary," Robert added, placing a protective hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Even when it's uncomfortable." Bishop Coleman's face flushed with anger. "This is not a debate, Mr. Blackwood. The Church has procedures for situations involving potentially supernatural phenomena, especially when they intersect with sacred objects and spaces. I will be contacting Rome immediately. Until representatives arrive, that box is not to be touched. And your son," he pointed a trembling finger at Elijah, who met his gaze without flinching, "your son is to remain away from church property." "You're making a mistake, Bishop," Elijah said softly. "The box wants to be opened now. That's why I was brought here." "The box wants?" Bishop Coleman repeated incredulously. "Objects don't want anything, boy." "This one does," Elijah insisted. "It's been waiting a long time. Have you ever experienced something similar? Let us know in the comments." The tension in the church was palpable, like the charged air before a storm. Bishop Coleman stood rigid, his authority challenged not by the adults present, but by a 10-year-old boy with eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to the secrets beneath. "You won't believe what happened next. Watch until the end." "This discussion is over," the bishop declared, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The access panel will be sealed until proper authorities arrive from Rome. Father Matthias, find something to secure it." The younger priest nodded and hurried away, clearly relieved to have a reason to distance himself from the unsettling scene. Father Laurent remained kneeling beside the opening, his gnarled fingers absently touching the small key that hung beneath his clothes. His rheumy eyes were fixed on Elijah with a mixture of fear and wonder. "What else do you know, child?" he asked softly. "What else has the truth shown you?" Before Elijah could respond, Bishop Coleman cut in sharply. "Father Laurent, this is highly inappropriate. The boy is not an oracle to be consulted. Whatever abilities he possesses, they require careful examination by qualified experts." "With all due respect, Bishop," Father Laurent replied, his voice strengthening, "I have served this parish for over 40 years. If there are secrets buried in its foundations, secrets that have been entrusted to my care, however unknowingly, I believe I have the right to hear them." Margaret Blackwood stepped forward, her hand still resting protectively on her son's shoulder. "Elijah doesn't always know specifics, Father. He sees patterns, connections, sometimes clear images, Sometimes just impressions. I know the box is important, Elijah added, his childish voice jarringly normal after all the tension. And I know it's connected to me somehow, to why I can see the things I see. Bishop Coleman scoffed, though there was a tremor in his voice. Preposterous. This box has been here for decades, perhaps a century. You've been alive for 10 years. There can't possibly be a connection. Not to me specifically, Elijah clarified, with the patience of someone explaining a simple concept to a confused adult. To people like me, the box contains a confession about someone else who could see the truth. Someone Père Christophe met when he first came to New Orleans. Father Laurent's breath caught audibly. "The Creole seer," he whispered. "I always thought it was just a local legend." "What are you talking about?" Bishop Coleman demanded. The elderly priest slowly rose to his feet, wincing slightly as his aged joints protested. "There's an old story, passed down through generations in this parish. When Père Christophe first arrived in New Orleans in the 1830s, he encountered a young Creole woman who was said to have the gift of seeing beyond the veil. She could reportedly look at a person and know their deepest secrets, their true nature. Some called her blessed, others called her a witch, but Père Christophe was fascinated by her. This is mere local superstition," the bishop dismissed. "Perhaps," Father Laurent conceded, "but the legend also says that Père Christophe built St. Augustine's to protect something precious, something connected to the seer. Most assumed it was a relic, but maybe it was his testimony about her gift," Elijah finished. "His proof that people like me have always existed." The sound of footsteps announced Father Matthias's return. He carried a length of heavy chain and a padlock. "This should secure it temporarily," he said, avoiding looking directly at either Elijah or the opening in the floor. "Good," Bishop Coleman nodded approvingly. "Seal it at once. Then I want the church locked until further notice." Robert Blackwood, who had been quietly observing the unfolding drama, finally spoke. "Before you seal away evidence that might help us understand our son's abilities, Bishop, consider this. What if the church has encountered children like Elijah before? What if that box contains information that could help him, help us, make sense of his gift? That's precisely why it needs to remain sealed until proper authorities can examine it," the bishop countered. "If it does indeed contain significant theological or historical information, all the more reason for careful, sanctioned study." As they argued, no one noticed Elijah slip away from his mother's side. The boy moved silently to the opening in the floor and knelt beside it, peering down at the ancient box with its 7 brass locks. "It's waking up," he said quietly. Something in his tone cut through the adults. Debate. They turned to find Elijah leaning over the opening, his pale eyes fixed on the box below. "Get away from there," Bishop Coleman commanded. But Elijah didn't move. Instead, he pointed to the box. "Look," he said simply. Despite themselves, they looked. In the beam of Father Laurent's torch, they could see something impossible happening. The ancient wood of the box seemed to be changing, the dark, aged surface lightening in patches, as if decades of tarnish were being wiped away by an invisible hand. "Dear God," Father Laurent breathed. "What's happening to it?" Margaret asked, moving closer to her son. "It's remembering," Elijah replied cryptically. Before anyone could question this strange statement, a new phenomenon began. Small points of light appeared on the surface of the box, directly over each of the 7 locks. They glowed with a soft, golden radiance, like candle flames seen through frosted glass. "This is some kind of trick," Bishop Coleman insisted, though his voice shook. "Some parlor illusion." "No, Bishop," Father Laurent said softly. "This is something else, entirely." The elderly priest reached beneath his collar and pulled out the small key he had carried for decades. In the dim light beneath the altar, It seemed to shimmer with the same golden glow as the points of light on the box. "Father, don't," Father Matthias exclaimed. "We should wait for instructions from Rome." But Father Laurent seemed beyond hearing. With movements both reverent and determined, he lowered himself into the cramped space beneath the altar, crawling awkwardly until he reached the box. The beam of his dropped torch illuminated the scene in harsh, dramatic shadows. "Father Laurent, I forbid this," Bishop Coleman shouted, his face flushed with anger and fear. The elderly priest paused, looking up at the faces peering down at him from the opening above. "I have served God and this parish faithfully for over 4 decades. Bishop," he said, his voice steady despite his precarious position, "if this box has been entrusted to my care, if this key has been waiting around my neck all these years, then perhaps it is God's will that I be the one to begin unlocking its secrets." Before further objections could be raised, Father Laurent inserted his small key into the 3rd lock. It fit perfectly. With a soft click that seemed to reverberate through the church like a thunderclap, the lock opened. The effect was immediate and astonishing. The golden light emanating from that particular lock flared brightly, then shot upward in a narrow beam that passed through the marble altar above and continued toward the church ceiling. Everyone stumbled back from the opening, even Elijah, as Father Laurent hastily extracted himself from the space beneath the altar. The beam of light continued to shine, steady and unwavering, illuminating motes of dust in the church air. "What have you done?" Bishop Coleman whispered, his earlier authority replaced by naked fear. "Who fulfilled my purpose, I believe," Father Laurent replied, his aged face serene despite the extraordinary circumstances, or at least begun to. The beam of light suddenly widened, like a spotlight expanding its focus. Within its golden glow, something impossible began to take shape, a tableau of light and shadow that formed moving images, like a film projected on the very air of the church. They saw a young Frenchman in the clerical clothes of the previous century, writing feverishly at a small desk by candlelight. His face was haggard but determined as he filled page after page with dense script, Père Christophe. Father Laurent breathed in recognition. The scene shifted. The same priest, now walking through the streets of old New Orleans. He paused before a small cottage where a young woman sat on the porch. When she looked up at him, her eyes were unnervingly similar to Elijah's, pale, piercing, filled with an awareness that seemed beyond human. "The Creole seer," Father Laurent whispered. Again the scene changed. Père Christophe arguing passionately with church officials, gesturing to plans spread across a table, architectural drawings of Saint Augustine's. His face was flushed with conviction as he pointed to a specific area beneath the altar. The images began to move faster now, flickering between scenes like pages being rapidly turned. The construction of the church, the priest secretly placing the box beneath the altar stone, the young woman with the pale eyes teaching children who shared her gift, Père Christophe writing his confession, tears streaming down his face, the priest on his deathbed, whispering instructions to a younger cleric as he handed him a small brass key. Then abruptly, the light collapsed back into a narrow beam and vanished, plunging the church into relative darkness. In the silence that followed, even the most skeptical among them knew they had witnessed something beyond ordinary explanation. Elijah was the first to speak. He built the church to protect her, not to contain something evil, he said quietly. The Creole seer was being hunted by those who feared her gift. Père Christophe believed she was touched by God, not the devil. He created a sanctuary for her and others like her. The boy turned his pale eyes to Bishop Coleman. "The box doesn't contain a confession of sin, Bishop. It contains a confession of faith. Faith in people like me." The bishop stood frozen, his worldview visibly crumbling around him. Father Matthias had sunk to his knees in prayer, the chain and padlock forgotten beside him. Father Laurent alone seemed at peace, a slight smile playing on his lined face. The other 6 keys, the elderly priest said, "We must find them." "They'll find their way to us," Elijah replied with certainty. "Now that the first lock has been opened, the others will reveal themselves when the time is right." What happens when all 7 locks are opened?" Margaret asked, her voice hushed with wonder. Elijah turned to his mother, and for a moment he looked like any other 10-year-old boy, vulnerable, seeking reassurance. "I don't know exactly, but I think I'll find others like me. The truth has been hidden for too long. It wants to be known." Robert Blackwood placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together, as a family." In the days that followed, word spread throughout New Orleans of the miraculous events at St. Augustine's Church. Despite Bishop Coleman's attempts to control the narrative, parishioners and curious onlookers alike flocked to the church, hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy with the pale eyes who could see the truth hidden in souls. Father Laurent, with a vigor that belied his years, began researching the history of Père Christophe and the Creole seer. In dusty archives and forgotten journals, he found scattered references that confirmed much of what they had witnessed in the church that day. The seer had indeed existed, and Père Christophe had been her protector and chronicler. More surprisingly, Father Laurent discovered mentions of other truth-seers throughout history, individuals who shared Elijah's uncanny abilities. Some had been revered as saints, others persecuted as witches or demons. But all had left their mark on the communities that encountered them. Bishop Coleman, faced with undeniable evidence of something beyond his understanding, reluctantly agreed to delay contacting Rome until they had learned more. His ambition for advancement within the church hierarchy was tempered by a growing fear that he might find himself on the wrong side of what could prove to be a significant theological discovery. Father Matthias requested a transfer to another parish, which was granted. His faith, shaken by his encounters with Elijah, required distance and reflection to rebuild. As for Elijah himself, the boy remained remarkably unchanged by the tumultuous events. He continued to see the truths that others couldn't or wouldn't see. But now he had context for his gift. He wasn't alone, wasn't an aberration. He was part of a lineage that stretched back through centuries, a lineage that Père Christophe had recognized and sought to preserve. One by one, over the course of the following year, the remaining 6 keys found their way to St. Augustine's Church. A retired nun discovered one while sorting through her deceased brother's effects. A fisherman found another tangled in his nets in Lake Pontchartrain. A young girl unearthed one while planting flowers in her garden. With each key that turned in its lock, another beam of golden light emerged. Another chapter of the hidden history revealed itself. The congregants of St. Augustine's grew accustomed to these miraculous displays, these windows into a past where faith and wonder intersected. And when the 7th and final key, found clutched in the talons of a falcon that had inexplicably flown into the church during Sunday service, turned in its lock, something remarkable happened. The box didn't open as many had expected. Instead, it dissolved into pure golden light that spread throughout the church, touching every person present. In that moment, for the briefest of instants, everyone experienced Elijah's gift. They saw the truth in each other, the pain and joy, the secrets and hopes, the entirety of each human soul laid bare. It was terrifying and beautiful, devastating and healing. When the light faded, the box was gone, its purpose fulfilled. But its legacy remained in the form of a small community that had formed around Elijah. Individuals from across New Orleans who had discovered, in the wake of that final revelation, that they too possessed fragments of the truth-seeing gift. Some could sense emotions, others could detect lies, still others could glimpse fragments of the past or future. Father Laurent, with the bishop's reluctant blessing, established a small school within the church grounds where these individuals could learn to understand and control their abilities. Elijah, despite his youth, became both student and teacher, his experience providing a foundation for others just discovering their gifts. The feared boy became the cherished boy, his baptism finally completed in a ceremony attended by hundreds. When Father Laurent lowered him into the baptismal font, the water didn't boil. Instead, it glowed with the same golden light that had emanated from the box. The church never officially recognized the events at St. Augustine's. The representatives from Rome, just as Elijah had predicted, never arrived. But in New Orleans, where the veil between worlds had always hung thin, the story of the boy with pale eyes who could see the truth became part of the city's rich tapestry of legends. And if visitors to St. Augustine's sometimes noticed that the confessions they whispered in the privacy of the booth seemed to be already known by the priests who absolved them, they chalked it up to the peculiar holiness of the place. A church built not to contain darkness, but to protect the light of truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. If you want to hear more whispers from the darkness, follow this channel. The next story might be closer than you imagine.